Local rangers call Big Bend Ranch Park the graveyard of the overconfident. Over the past 20 years, more experienced hikers have died here than beginners. The paradox has a simple explanation. Professionals come here with unshakable faith in their experience and maps that create the illusion of understanding the terrain. But in this primitive chaos, where daytime temperatures turn rocks into red-hot frying pans and trails exist only in the imagination, overconfidence becomes a death sentence. In October 2013, Arkansas journalists Katie Fry and Rick McFarland will become part of these statistics. Their years of hiking experience will turn against them when a promotional brochure, passed off as a map, leads them into a trap with no way out. 8 hours later, the desert would present them with a choice that no survival guide could prepare them for. In the fall of 2013, Katie Fry was 43, and her husband Rick McFarland was 58. They were no strangers to extreme conditions. Both worked for the Arkansas Democrat newspaper. Katie was an investigative reporter, and Rick was a photographer. Their profession taught them to work in the epicenter of chaos. They chased tornadoes and reported from flood and hurricane zones. This experience forged in them what they themselves called armor against uncertainty. They were accustomed to stress and believed they could keep their cool when the world around them was falling apart. Their connection to the Big Bend region was almost sacred. For 12 years in a row, they had come here to celebrate their wedding anniversary, which had taken place here on one of the national park trails. They were experts, but their experience was limited to a different, more predictable and civilized world of marked trails and ranger stations within walking distance. Every year they left their children, 10-year-old Amanda and 8-year-old Ethan, with Katie's parents, and set off on their personal pilgrimage to silence and stars. The 2013 trip was no exception. On Monday, 30th of September, they set up camp in the national park. The evening was perfect. They grilled steaks, drank wine from plastic cups, and watched the Milky Way spill across the inky sky. But in the morning, they were awakened by the voice of a ranger at their tent. The U.S. federal government had shut down, and all of the country's national parks were closing. They had until noon to leave. In response to their confusion, the ranger gave them some simple, friendly advice. He mentioned that the neighboring Big Bend Ranch State Park remained open. It wasn't a warning. It was just useful information thrown in casually. An hour later, Katie and Rick were at the state park's visitor center. They explained to the attendant that they were looking for a day hike, mentioning their years of experience in the neighboring park. The attendant nodded and sketched a loop route on a simple tourist brochure. It wasn't a topographic map. It was an explorer's map, an advertising brochure where the complex, unmarked path through the canyons was marked with a simple line, creating the illusion of ease and accessibility. The trap snapped shut on Wednesday morning, the 2nd October. At 10:15 a.m., they parked at the trailhead. They took 8 half-liter bottles of water out of the car refrigerator. Their total supply for 2 people for a whole day in such heat was only 4 liters. Contrary to their long-standing habit, they did not leave a note on the windshield describing the route. They were absolutely confident in themselves and in the easy day trip. They slung their backpacks over their shoulders and stepped onto the trail. The first 2.5 miles of the trail were deceptively easy. The trail wound through a desert landscape, among flowering cacti and buzzing bees. The sun had not yet reached its full strength, and a light breeze brought coolness. Katie, enchanted by the wild beauty, even thought that this route might become her new favorite place. Soon they reached the West Rim Overlook, a breathtaking view of Fresno Canyon and rock formations resembling frozen waves opened up before them. This was their point of no return, their last chance to make the right decision. They could simply turn around and walk back to the car the same way they came. It would take a couple of hours, and they still had water. But Rick took out his camera and started taking pictures, and Katie unfolded their explorer's map. On this schematic brochure, the ruins of the old ranch seemed very close, as if they were within arm's reach. The illusion of simplicity created by the inaccurate map pushed them to make a fateful choice. They decided to continue along the loop, confident that it would be as easy as the beginning. The illusion was shattered almost instantly. As soon as they left the observation deck, the trail turned into its opposite. It descended steeply into Fresno Canyon, over loose gravel and sharp rocks. This was no longer a tourist route, but a technically challenging descent that required concentration at every step. For Katie, it immediately became a challenge. Her old shoulder injury made itself felt, and she had to constantly lean on a wooden stick, feeling her strength leaving her with every step down. They descended for a long time, and the sun rose higher and higher. The heat became thick and oppressive. Sweat poured into their eyes, and their clothes stuck to their bodies. By the time they reached the bottom of the canyon, it was already 1:30 in the afternoon. The temperature had risen to 91.4 Fahrenheit. Near the ruins of an old ranch, they saw a parked Jeep with Canadian license plates. It was the first sign of other people all day, but their relief was short-lived. After checking their supplies, they realized that each of them had already drunk 3 of their 4 bottles of water. They had only 1 half-liter bottle per person left for the rest of the journey, the climb, and the return to the car. They collapsed into the narrow strip of shade cast by the SUV. The water they drank was warm and offered little relief. It was here, in the shade of a stranger's car, that their armor against uncertainty suffered its first fatal crack. Their established roles and approaches to risk collided. Katie's intuition told her that this was a mistake. As an investigative journalist, she was used to analyzing facts, and the facts said that staying was the most logical and safest option. She suggested waiting for the car's owners. But for Rick, a photographer accustomed to acting rather than waiting, the very idea of passive waiting was unbearable. In his mind, it was tantamount to admitting defeat, losing control of the situation. Their entire professional lives had taught them to move forward, toward the epicenter of events, rather than sit on the sidelines. It wasn't a loud argument. It was a quiet battle between 2 worldviews, exacerbated by fatigue and dehydration. 12 years of marriage and dozens of joint expeditions had built a strong model of trust between them. Rick had always been the strong one, the one who led them through physical challenges. In a state of increasing exhaustion, arguing and proving her point required energy that Katie had almost none left of. It was easier to give in to his confidence, to trust his leadership. Rick insisted, convinced that the map would lead them to a quick end to the loop. They sat in the shade for a few minutes, calling for help, but the canyon swallowed their cries. Then they got up and moved on, choosing movement, which gave the illusion of control over immobility, which could have saved them. But they followed a dry creek bed that was marked on their map as part of the trail. Soon, Rick spotted a faded ribbon on a tree branch, and taking it as a good sign, they began to climb the steep slope. Hope quickly turned to despair. During one of their short breaks, Rick asked Katie for a granola bar. She reached for her waist bag and froze. The bag was gone. Somewhere on this challenging climb, it had slipped and fallen, and they hadn't even noticed. Along with it, they had lost all their food. It was pointless and too dangerous to go back. They silently continued on, pushing through the thorny bushes. Soon, several vultures began to circle slowly above their heads. Their shadows glided silently across the ground, accompanying the 2 weary travelers. By 7 o'clock in the evening, exhausted, they saw a sign ahead, Trail to Mexicano Falls. Their hearts beat faster. It was a surge of hope. They were on the right track, but their joy was short-lived. The trail led them to the edge of the canyon and simply disappeared. It dissolved into the rocks, ending nowhere. 9 miles had led them to a dead end. They were alone, without food, without water. Katie's last attempt to send a message from her phone failed. There was no network. Night was falling. Rick, looking at the rapidly darkening sky, muttered quietly that it would soon be cold. The first night in the desert was over. Dawn brought no relief, only the realization of the full depth of their situation. They woke up from the cold that penetrated to their bones. 14 hours without a single sip of water had turned their mouths into a dry, rough desert. Shivering, they got to their feet and walked to the last cairn, which they could barely make out in the evening twilight. and then Rick noticed what they had missed in the darkness. Behind the first cairn there were two more. It became clear that yesterday they had made a second, possibly fatal mistake. They had mistakenly climbed up to the observation deck instead of following the main trail. This discovery gave them a brief, desperate burst of hope. The map showed that their car was still about 5 miles away, but now at least they were looking in the right direction. For a while, they walked with new determination. Katie even forced herself to smile, even though her body was screaming with exhaustion. But the desert had no intention of letting them go. Soon the cairns disappeared again, dissolving into the endless folds of the landscape. Their path turned into a torturous wander through dozens of dry riverbeds, or arroyos. Each descent was followed by an exhausting climb, and the prickly cat's claw bushes dug into their skin, leaving deep, bleeding scratches. At 9:53 a.m., they made another attempt to contact the outside world. Rick turned on his phone, but there was still no signal. They typed a message to Katie's father, asking him to call the Rangers, but it was never sent. The screen went blank. This time there was no panic, no tears, only a silent, heavy awareness of their complete isolation. They continued to whisper, like a prayer, that they had to get back to their children, clinging to the thought like a last thread. By noon, the heat had become unbearable. It was then that Katie, whose profession had taught her to prepare for the worst, remembered the book Death in Big Bend. It told the story of a woman who survived only because she hid from the midday sun. She convinced Rick to find shelter. They were lucky. They stumbled upon a rock formation that cast a narrow strip of shade, barely enough to fit two people. A prickly pear cactus grew nearby. Without hesitation, Katie cut it with a knife and dug into the slimy, bitter flesh. Hundreds of tiny needles stuck into her tongue and cheeks, but she paid no attention to them. The moisture was worth the pain. Rick tried it, but he immediately felt sick and spat out the precious liquid. Katie desperately yelled at him not to waste the water that was left in their bodies. It wasn't anger, but the cry of a person who was ready to do anything for another sip. She took his share and ate it. At sunset, when the clouds on the horizon began to darken, Rick suddenly froze. He saw in the distance what is synonymous with life in the desert, the green tops of poplar trees. "Water!" he shouted, and without another word, he ran. Katie tried to follow him, but her legs gave way. She fell down the steep slope, sliding down on her back and scraping the skin off her arms. At the bottom of the ravine, she realized she had lost control of her bladder, but in her clouded mind, she took it as a good sign. Her body was still functioning. She heard Rick's voice and crawled toward the sound. He found a dirty puddle first, and behind it, under a boulder, a minor miracle. A thin stream of clean water gushed directly from under the rock. They drank greedily, their hands shaking. It was their first water in 27 hours. The euphoria of finding water was short-lived. They laughed through cracked lips and even joked about bacteria. Katie said she didn't care if the water killed her later, as long as it didn't kill her now. The spring revived them, but it was only a respite, not a salvation. They were still lost, they had no food, and the spring itself was too small to stay with for long. When the second night came, the cold returned with a vengeance. They huddled together by the spring, too weak to try to build a fire. Rick soon fell asleep from complete exhaustion, but Katie couldn't close her eyes. Her mind was on the edge. The thought of having to walk through this endless maze of rocks and thorns again tomorrow was unbearable. She looked at Rick sleeping and whispered softly. She said she couldn't do it anymore, that her body and mind were broken, that she was done with it. Their partnership, which had helped them survive until now, was beginning to crack under the pressure of despair. Friday morning, the third day of their ordeal, began with them drinking as much water as they could and filling their bottles. They followed the stream bed again, found a couple of faded ribbons on the trees, but, as before, the trail soon disappeared. The cycle of hope and despair repeated itself, and it finally broke Rick. He no longer trusted the maps or the markers. He stopped and looked at the distant ridge. He was sure he recognized it, that he had seen it on the first day from the observation deck. It was a decision born of desperation. "To hell with the markers!" he shouted. "I know the way. Our car is over there." The following 5 hours turned into a grueling march based solely on Rick's intuition. Katie asked him again and again if he was sure, and each time he answered more firmly, trying to convince not so much her as himself. But Katie's strength was running out. Her legs buckled, and she asked to rest every 5 minutes. Around noon, she saw a small mesquite tree in a narrow ravine. She simply collapsed on the ground beneath it. Rick stood over her, his pleas to continue the journey falling on his wife's empty, detached gaze. He could see that she would not get up again. It was a choice no husband should have to make, a silent struggle between hope and cruel reality. Finally, he nodded. A silent exchange took place. He handed her his knife, the only tool they had. Then he poured half of his precious last water into her bottle. Their farewell was almost silent, a declaration of love uttered by cracked lips, her promise to wait, no matter what. Then came the mother's last request to her husband, to tell their children that she had done everything she could to return. Rick interrupted her, unwilling to accept such an ending, and insisted that she tell them everything herself. In a desperate attempt to bring a moment of normality back to this nightmare, he even tried to joke, asking if she wanted him to get her anything from the other side. She found the strength to play along, asking for 2 bottles of water and a beer. The last gesture was a firm handshake that lasted a moment, but encompassed 12 years of marriage. Then Rick turned and walked toward the horizon. He looked back only once to wave to her. Katie watched as his figure grew smaller and smaller until he finally disappeared into the shimmering haze of the hot air. From that moment on, their struggle for survival became a solitary one. Left alone, Katie submitted to the only goal she had left: to wait. She made her shelter under the low branches of a mesquite tree. To protect herself from the merciless sun, she wedged one of her boots into the branches, creating a small patch of shade, and placed the other under her head as a pillow. Time stood still, turning into a viscous, drawn-out cycle of heat and cold. Her thirst became animalistic, primal. At some point, in a fog of despair, she took out the knife Rick had left her. The blade was dull, but she ran it across her forearm 6 times until tiny beads of blood appeared on her skin. Without horror, without hesitation, with only the cold logic of survival, she licked them off, tasting metal, salt, and fading life in her mouth. Her mind began to give way. Reality shattered into fragments, replaced by vivid, agonizing hallucinations. It seemed to her that Rick had returned and was sleeping somewhere nearby, under the same tree. She called to him, but there was only silence in response. Then she saw the women of the wind, the spirits of her ancestors, who controlled the roar of the helicopter blades, turning it into the music of the desert. She watched them dreamily, afraid to move, lest she break their trust. At the same time, Rick was racing against death. He walked, driven by the single thought that not only his life, but also Katie's life, depended on him. Each of the 58 years of his life weighed heavily on him. He fell, losing consciousness from dehydration, but got up again. He hid from the scorching sun under thorny creosote bushes, hanging his hat on a branch to create at least some shade. His consciousness also began to wander. Images of home flashed before his eyes. Katie on the porch, their children, Amanda and Ethan, chasing fireflies in the thick summer air filled with laughter. These visions were both a salvation and a torture. He found a pile of rocks shaped like a chair and collapsed into it. He knew that if he stayed here, he would die. He whispered aloud to himself, "If I sit down, I will die, and if I die, Katie will die too." These words became his mantra. Gathering his last strength, he got back on his feet. And then at sunset, he saw it. A faint glimmer on the horizon, where it shouldn't have been. His eyes had deceived him many times before, and he didn't believe them again. But something made him raise his camera to his face. He, a professional photographer, used his working tool as his last hope. He pointed the lens at the flicker and zoomed in as far as it would go. In the viewfinder, he saw not a mirage, but the clear outline of an SUV parked at the start of some kind of trail. The tool that had earned him a living for decades had now given him his life back. Reaching his pickup truck, Rick yanked open the door and grabbed the car cooler. He gulped down one bottle of water, then another. The shock of the cold liquid was both agony and salvation. After that, he drained a can of Modelo beer to wash away the dryness in his throat. At 7:28 p.m., his phone picked up a signal, and a short message asking his father-in-law to call for help was finally sent. 15 minutes later, he burst into the ranger station, honking his horn continuously. He was met by Park Assistant Superintendent David Dutter. Rick, barely able to stand, told him everything. Dutter immediately set out on the first search party. He went into the darkness alone with a flashlight and a megaphone, shouting Katie's name. 2 hours later, he returned empty-handed. Rick's heart sank. "Is she gone? Is she dead?" raced through his mind. While a full-scale rescue operation was underway at the base, 3 investigators from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department approached Rick: Captain Ray Spears and Inspectors Brent Tucker and Kenneth Watson. For the next 2.5 hours, while Rick struggled with guilt and despair, they questioned him. They looked for inconsistencies in his story, subtly hinting that he might have been involved in his wife's disappearance. Rick, exhausted and grief-stricken, showed them photos from his camera. The pictures of a smiling, lively Katie, taken on the first day of the hike, became his main alibi. Just as Rick was being questioned as a potential suspect, Katie, lying in her ravine, heard the hum of a helicopter. It was the first team sent to search for her. Hope burned through her. She crawled out from under her tree, too weak to stand, and began waving her arms, screaming with all her might. But the searchlight glided over the ridges, never looking into her hiding place. The helicopter flew away. It was the darkest moment of her ordeal. In utter despair, rolling on the ground, she felt her wedding ring slip off her parched finger. The desert had taken her last connection to the world. By Sunday morning, the search operation had grown to 40 people. Inspector Brent Tucker, convinced of the truth of Rick's story, studied the map and pointed to the third ridge from the place where they were last seen. "She's there," he said with confidence. Among the searchers were experienced tracker Fernie Rincon and Inspector Isaac Ruiz. They moved not by grid, but by intuition, reading the subtle signs of the desert. Around noon, they stopped. Rincon thought he heard something. They shouted, and from a deep ravine about 165 feet away, a faint, inhuman cry came in response. They found her under that very mesquite tree. She was naked, her body resembling a skeleton covered with burnt skin. She was delirious and muttering something about her wedding. The rescuers took off their shirts and covered her shivering body. Rincon asked if she knew her name. She croaked, "Katie." When they told her it was Sunday, she looked at them with a blank stare. She thought it was still Friday. They gave her water drop by drop from a bottle cap, so as not to harm her exhausted body. Due to the government shutdown, all federal helicopters were grounded, but a Border Patrol pilot volunteered to evacuate her. This act of mercy closed the tragic circle that began with the closure of the national park. Rick waited for her in the sterile corridor of the El Paso hospital, and the cleanliness seemed almost offensive after the dirt and dust of the last few days. He prepared himself for the worst, for the sight of a lifeless body entangled in tubes. But when the stretcher was wheeled into the ward, he saw her eyes. They were open. A barely audible hoarse chuckle came from under the oxygen mask, and that sound, absurd and wonderful, finally broke him. The conversation with the doctors was short and businesslike, their words as sharp as the rocks in Fresno Canyon. Counting down the hours until death. Acute kidney failure. Heart and liver damage. The paradox was that she, dying of thirst, could not be given too much water at once. It could kill her. Salvation was only the beginning of a new, no less dangerous battle. The following days turned into a different kind of torture. While IVs slowly brought life back to her dehydrated body, the nurse, armed with tweezers, waged her own war for hours. She extracted hundreds of tiny cactus needles from her skin, mouth, and throat, each one a painful reminder of the prickly pear she had eaten. Rick sat nearby, holding her hand, and listening to her cries of pain echoing down the hallway, drowning out the monotonous beeping of the medical equipment. 3 days later, she was discharged. When they pulled up to their home in Arkansas, their children, Amanda and Ethan, who had just learned the truth, ran out to meet them. Katie carefully got out of the car, fell to her knees, and hugged them, breathing in the scent of their hair. A month later, they returned to Big Bend Ranch. They were accompanied by Brent Tucker, the same inspector who had questioned Rick. He led them to the same mesquite tree. Katie silently placed her hand on its trunk. "This is where I waited," she said quietly. Rick searched the ground around it for her ring but never found it. She accepted this loss as a sacrifice to the land that had nearly killed her, but ultimately spared her. The story of Katie Frye and Rick McFarland is not just a tale of survival in the desert. It is a story about what happens when 12 years of life together collide with the primal instinct for self-preservation. Love is tested not by romantic vows, but by the choice between dying together or betraying each other for the sake of survival. What really happened at that moment when Rick turned his back on his dying wife and walked into the sunset? Was it an act of supreme love, sacrificing his own conscience for the sake of her life? Or did the survival instinct simply find a noble excuse for escape? Write in the comments what you think about this story and what you think really happened. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episodes.